Hey everyone, welcome to the Open Question. Imagine hearing three nearly identical stories from three different people, each insisting their version is the original. It can feel puzzling, especially when those stories overlap in so many ways. For centuries, the major Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, have echoed, borrowed, and reinterpreted one another's teachings, narratives, and traditions. They trace their roots to the same legendary figure, Abraham, yet each religion claims a unique path. Despite those claims, the similarities can be striking when you dig into their scriptures and histories. An interesting place to start is with the basic idea of one supreme being. All three uphold belief in a single, all-powerful deity who created everything. This might sound straightforward, but in ancient times, monotheism was not common. People typically worshipped many gods who had different responsibilities. The Abrahamic faiths introduced a single deity who controls everything, rewards the righteous, and punishes wrongdoing. Judaism is considered the oldest among them, originating with an emphasis on a covenant between Abraham and his God. Christianity, which emerged later, took the Jewish scriptures and added its own layers, centered on the life and teachings of Jesus. Islam appeared centuries after Christianity and recognized many elements of Jewish and Christian tradition, while also including its own revelations to the Prophet Muhammad. When these developments are lined up, it's like seeing a series of edited and expanded editions of a very old manuscript. One way these religions reflect each other is through shared narratives. The story of Adam and Eve appears in all three, illustrating the idea that humanity started with a single pair. Noah's flood is another example. Ancient people from various cultures had flood stories, but the version featuring Noah is common to Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. The Book of Genesis in the Hebrew Bible, the Christian Old Testament, and Islamic text in the Quran describe this massive flood that wiped out civilization. In each version, a righteous man is spared by building a boat to save pairs of animals. The basic plot stays the same, but each religious tradition adds its own nuances about why the flood happened and what its moral lessons are. This repeating pattern of retelling can be seen in many other biblical figures as well, including Abraham, Moses, and David. Historical records show the influence of Judaism on early Christian communities. In the 1st century, the followers of Jesus were mostly Jewish, and they worshipped in synagogues. They accepted the Hebrew Bible as sacred. Over time, beliefs about Jesus as the Messiah set this new group apart, creating a new religion. But the foundation was very much Jewish, and many of the moral principles in Christianity mirror the Ten Commandments. When Islam arrived on the scene, it recognized figures like Moses and Jesus as prophets, identified the same God as in Judaism and Christianity, and even recounted many of the same events found in earlier scriptures. Another area of similarity is moral law. The Ten Commandments in Judaism are a set of ethical instructions. Christianity took these rules and emphasized their universal value, teaching followers to follow them and focus on compassion for others. Islam expanded upon the same ethical traditions by laying out clear practices and prohibitions in the Quran. In many ways, all three maintain an interest in justice, mercy, and treating neighbors kindly. This can be seen as an inheritance, where the moral framework passes from one religion to the next, each adding its own interpretations. Beliefs about the end of the world also show how these religions share core concepts. Each faith teaches a final reckoning where the righteous will be saved and the wicked will face consequences. The Hebrew Bible speaks of a day of judgment. Christianity focuses on the second coming of Christ, and Islam details a day of resurrection with vivid descriptions of reward and punishment. Though details vary, the core idea that human history will culminate in a divine judgment remains consistent. This reflects a shared worldview. History is linear and has a clear beginning and end, guided by God. Even in the modern world, echoes of one tradition can be found in the practices of another. Jewish dietary laws, known as kosher rules, have some parallels with Islamic dietary restrictions called halal. Both sets of laws forbid the consumption of pork, require a specific method of slaughter, and offer guidelines for which foods are permissible. Similarities in dietary codes are not a coincidence. They likely stem from cultural and geographic contexts where these religions originated, and also from their shared theological roots. Meanwhile, Christianity developed different views on dietary laws, often more lenient, but the influence of Old Testament guidelines lingered in early Christian history before evolving into different practices. Cultural habits also overlap. Historical records show that Christians living under Muslim rule in the Middle Ages often interacted and borrowed certain customs from their neighbors. Islamic scholars, for instance, preserved many Greek texts that later influenced Christian Europe. Meanwhile, Christians shaped how Islam handled issues of theology and philosophy. This pattern of interchange has been ongoing for centuries. In parts of the world today, you might see how certain festivals, social norms, and religious rituals look surprisingly similar across these faiths. Holidays like Passover, Easter, and Ramadan revolve around themes of reflection, sacrifice, and celebration. While details differ, the idea of dedicating a period to spiritual renewal is central in all three. Scriptural references tie these religions together in ways that can be surprising to someone who has not studied them in detail. The Quran mentions figures such as Abraham, Moses, and Jesus multiple times. In fact, Moses is one of the most frequently mentioned prophets in the Quran. Jesus appears in many passages as well, indicating a strong link to earlier traditions. Some scholars say that around two-thirds of the Quran's prophetic narratives coincide with figures and events found in Jewish and Christian scriptures. This is not to say the texts are identical, but they share so much that it's impossible to deny the lines of influence. In addition to content, the style of revelation in Islam, words believed to be the direct speech of God, has parallels to the concept of divine speech in Judaism, where the Torah is understood by some as God's direct word to Moses. Christianity too holds a belief in the divine inspiration of Scripture, though with a slightly different interpretation. Looking through history, political leaders often use these religious similarities to their advantage. Rulers in Islamic Spain highlighted shared beliefs to maintain harmony between Muslim, Jewish, and Christian subjects, at least in certain periods. In other eras, Christian rulers aligned themselves with Jewish communities because of the shared biblical heritage, hoping to promote unity, or at least reduce internal conflict. Later, during the Crusades, the focus shifted to pointing out differences, but even then, polemics often revolved around the same biblical characters, each religion claiming to interpret the stories more accurately than the others. This repeated emphasis on shared scripture shows how deeply connected these faiths are, even when conflicts arise. Statistically, around half of the global population identifies with one of these three religions. Christianity is often cited as having over 2 billion followers, making it the world's largest religion. Islam follows closely, with well over 1 billion adherents. Judaism, though smaller in number, has a significant historical and cultural impact. Combined, these faiths make up a large segment of humanity. Given their size, their shared narratives have shaped laws, ethics, and cultural norms across the globe. The notion of a single God who issues moral commandments has influenced legal systems in many countries, sometimes directly shaping the structure of societies. Modern religious scholarship offers a window into how these religions shaped and were shaped by one another. Researchers look at linguistic similarities between scriptural texts, pointing out shared terms in Aramaic, Hebrew, and Arabic. Others compare parallel stories to show how they evolved over time, and how new theological concepts were introduced to fit different cultural contexts. For example, the figure of Jesus in Islam is respected as a prophet, born of a virgin, capable of miracles, yet not considered divine. This view indicates a distinct doctrinal stance, but the fact that Jesus appears at all points to a strong inheritance from earlier Christian and Jewish beliefs. Some people notice that elements of these religions might have roots in older mythologies. Many ancient Near Eastern cultures had epic tales about creation, floods, and heroes who talked to gods. Judaism emerged among these cultures, absorbed some of their themes, and presented them in a monotheistic framework. Christianity then built on Judaism's ideas, and Islam, in turn, took aspects of both Jewish and Christian traditions, blending them into a new message. This can be seen as a long chain of spiritual storytelling, where each link in the chain reworks older pieces. Recognizing these connections can lead to a broader understanding of how religions evolve. It doesn't mean they are invalid. It shows that ideas travel, people are influenced by their environment, and teachings transform as they move from one group to another. There are everyday examples of these shared roots. Interfaith families, for instance, might celebrate both Christmas and Hanukkah, showing how holidays from different religious calendars can coexist and sometimes blend. In some regions, it's common to see a mosque next to a church and maybe even a synagogue in the same neighborhood. Festivals bring people together, and while they might have different theological interpretations, the communal spirit can look very similar. Food traditions can also reveal points of overlap, like symbolic bread used in both Jewish Shabbat meals and Christian communion, or the tradition of breaking the fast each evening during Ramadan, which is reminiscent of festive family gatherings found in holidays like Passover or Easter. Though the specific reasons differ, the shared experience of community, prayer, and gratitude is often strikingly similar. Examining these similarities provides insight into human nature. People transmit stories, cultural practices, and ethical values through generations, adapting them to their immediate needs or new social environments. In times of conflict, religious identity can become a point of division, but in times of peace and cultural exchange, those shared roots can bring people closer. Observing how these faiths have borrowed from each other highlights how communities interact, trade ideas, and sometimes rework them into something fresh. Over the centuries, religious scholars have debated how to handle the similarities. Some argue these shared elements confirm the continuity of a divine plan. Others suggest they demonstrate natural cultural transmission, where good stories and moral lessons keep getting passed along because they resonate with people. Either way, there is no denying that Judaism, Christianity, and Islam are linked by a network of ancestral stories and teachings. The followers of one might claim they have the full truth, yet so much of that truth echoes what came before. People who study world religions sometimes compare this to siblings in a family. Each sibling has a distinct personality, talents, and quirks, yet they share parents, history, and a common environment. The squabbles are real, and the differences are there, but there's also a shared DNA that can't be ignored. In the case of religions, that shared DNA is found in the stories of Adam, Noah, Abraham, Moses, and many others, along with the notion of a just and merciful God who desires devotion and moral living. In modern times, conversations about these connections can be enlightening. They challenge assumptions about any one tradition standing in isolation. The evidence of cross-pollination is overwhelming. There are explicit references in texts, historical correspondences between religious communities, and overlapping rituals that persist to this day. Observing the parallels can encourage dialogue, reduce misunderstandings, and help people see that these religions are, at their core, part of a single extended family tree. The fact that large parts of their scriptures overlap isn't a coincidence. Each religion emerged in a context already shaped by its predecessors. Judaism laid the groundwork for monotheism and covenant. Christianity introduced ideas of salvation through Christ. Islam emphasized the oneness of God while recognizing previous prophets. At various points in time, leaders, theologians, and believers picked up on these overlaps, sometimes using them as a bridge, other times using them to set boundaries. Yet no matter how they are used, the fundamental reality remains. They share similar stories, messages, and even moral codes. Stories are powerful. They connect people, shape societies, and inspire actions. The story of Abraham's willingness to sacrifice his son is central in all three faiths, but has been used to illustrate different points about faith, obedience, and divine guidance. The fact that each religion preserves that story shows how deeply they draw from the same well. If this story had no resonance, it wouldn't have lasted. That it is cherished by such a large portion of humanity points to how fundamental it is to the Abrahamic worldview, one that keeps reappearing in new forms. Scriptural borrowing and adaptation is not unique to these religions. It happens across the world. But in the case of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. The process has been especially well documented because their texts have been painstakingly preserved, copied, and translated over centuries. Scholars can track the evolution of certain ideas and see how one scripture quotes or paraphrases another. It's almost like a giant jigsaw puzzle where each piece reveals something about the larger picture of humanity's search for meaning. Observing how these religions borrow or copy from each other can spark many discussions. Some might find it intriguing that there is so much in common, while others might question the originality of each faith. What is clear is that these three religions are intertwined in history, practice, and belief. That interconnection has influenced art, music, literature, politics, and ethics around the globe. It explains why references to biblical figures pop up not just in synagogues, churches, and mosques, but also in everyday speech, novels, movies, and social traditions. Many of the legal and social frameworks in countries with a Judeo-Christian or Islamic heritage trace back to similar ethical principles. Concepts of charity, fairness, and personal responsibility have biblical and Quranic roots. Even if some societies now have a more secular outlook, the historical influence of these texts is still woven into daily life. There have been studies about how moral choices in these societies often reflect Judeo-Christian or Islamic values, even among people who do not practice religion. It shows how deeply these ideas have penetrated cultural consciousness. Looking at it all, it becomes clear that the Abrahamic religions share a long, intertwined history. Each one grew out of the environment established by the one before it, adopting, altering, and sometimes challenging previous teachings. They highlight how humans adapt and reshape spiritual concepts to fit shifting cultural and historical contexts. While they do compete with each other at times, they also form a cohesive narrative that has guided billions of people for thousands of years. Recognizing these shared roots can be eye-opening. It reveals that these religions are far from strangers. They are close relatives telling overlapping versions of a very old story. And although each insists its version is the most accurate, the overlapping threads are unmistakable. That interconnected story continues to shape societies, spark debate, and inspire billions of people to this day. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.